Howard was aware of the artists that he admired from very early on, in particular artists like Bonnard and Vuillard, the Intimists, who were contemporary with Matisse, Degas, that generation of French artists. And his struggle was to get to a place where he had managed to break through to his own language. And I think that only happened roughly around the time he met Anthony, or just before he met Anthony. That seems to me
his long-term partner.
His long-term partner. So in a way, you could say that his work really begins, perhaps for me, it really begins in, the mid-70s. It's getting there, and then by the mid-80s, he's really on a roll. But it's not that he's a slow starter and just gets there. It's very, very thought about. But it's a terrible struggle. And I think for him it really was a terrible struggle, because there was no way other than doing it like that for him in his mind.
And he famously said painting was agony for him, that trying to express what he was feeling on the work. And in the 80s, as you said, because he represented Great Britain in the Venice Biennale in 84, he won the Turner Prize, a new Turner Prize, in 1985. Was that the time you both became familiar with his work more deeply, or was it even later than that?
For me, it was about 85.
Yeah, me too.
So the Turner Prize had an impact.
There was a Whitechapel show, which was maybe a year before. I can't remember exactly, but I became aware of him between about 82, 84, and 88.
By which time, I think Andrew would agree, his language was formed. He knew what he was saying and how he was saying it. Because what I would agree absolutely with Andrew is, it seems to me in the end, this is the really fundamental, really, really difficult problem. How do you make a painting or a picture now that is of the now, has a language that actually allows you to communicate with the people watching your picture and people standing in front of it, that is not simply taken from a previous period, is not pastiche and is not hackneyed. And I think that was the really, really hard problem that so many painters, all the good painters, have struggled with from the 1970s, 1980s onwards. And I think, as you can see looking around the walls here, we're in the presence of one of the very, very few people who cracked it.
Yes,
and the other person who did crack it, who's the British artist whom Howard, I think, felt closest to, who cracked it a bit earlier than Howard, was Patrick Caulfield.
Yes.
Who did arrive at his own mature style actually earlier a little bit than Howard did.
And in the early prints, I was quite surprised when I did research into Howard's prints, because I know them maybe from the 90s onwards. He went back from to the 50s, he started making prints, so it wasn't a new thing to be making them. But those early prints do have quite a flavour of Caulfield, the very thick black lines, the outlines, which is very different to how he worked when his style matured.
Well, they were very, very close, and there are those two great, great Howard paintings of Patrick Caulfield in Italy and Patrick Caulfield in Italy too, I think, which have just a bit of Caulfield to tease the viewer, and but it was a very close, very rich relationship.
And Howard admired. I mean, I remember because I'd been looking. I had lunch with Howard in Copley Street, probably about, I don't know how long ago, probably 1990 or 1992, and I'd been looking for years for a set of the Poems for Jules Laforgue edition. This book in 200 copies made by Patrick with just wonderful prints. And it's a book with 32 prints, plus you get 6 for nothing in the front.
I imagine not quite for nothing.
But I'd found it like years before, disappointingly, and it was 10,000 quid. And Howard and I were in that shop opposite the British Museum, and Howard just didn't say anything. And there it was, and I looked, and it's 400 quid. I said, put it away. So don't say anything, right. We went off and we had lunch. And I was going, just go back and pretend you're not really interested, just go and buy it. And so I went back and we bought it.
Did you? For £400?
For £400. So and
a steal.
But it's a very different language. It's interesting because those prints, I don't know if people here know them, but they're astonishingly beautiful. They're very almost very minimal, very pared down. So it's a pair of curtains in Patrick's very pared down style with a bird. Or a glass of water, which is definitely the inspiration for for Michael Craig Martin's An Oak Tree, the world's first conceptual work of art. It's just a copy of this Patrick Caulfield print, as indeed his other stuff is copies well, I mean, it's pastiche. But I mean, he's done something else with it. That's fine. That's the way of life. But
moving on.
But they're actually very similar in feeling. They are the works of art they are about the idea of going around a city and preserving your memories, the memories that burn themselves into your mind. So there's a sort of connection with Proust, but there's also a connection with all of those great French artists like the Intimists, like Bonnard and Vuillard, who would paint the apparition of someone on the street of Paris who struck them. And they're these little seized memories. And actually Howard's very last works, which are completely different in appearance, they're actually very close in feeling to that. This idea of a memory, cherished, preserved, this is what our experience is made of.
Well, this idea of memory just drives through the work all the way.
And it's his answer, I think, as to what a picture should be here and now, because he's not an abstract painter, and he hated the phrase, he didn't talk about. What he says again and again, and this is the real, I think, puzzle of Howard, is that he is painting memories of emotional moments, of engagements, of conversations, of places, but using colour and his own iconography to explain what's going on. Now, because none of us have lived Howard Hodgkin's life and had those conversations and been in those friendships, it's very, very hard for us to absorb back there. So there is an element of trust and a leap of faith in front of a Howard Hodgkin picture. And sometimes the iconography, as in the Alan Cristea prints here, with the bomb ticking away inside the kind of...
Just over there, those two.
The encompassing art world can be read, but most of the time it's quite hard. And I think that's what's interesting. And that's why he's written about, by Andrew and by so many other people so well, to write to have an artist that's easy to write about. You need an artist who draws you in and then confuses you. You can't have Susan Sontag writing about Michael Craig Martin, but you can have Susan Sontag writing beautifully about Howard Hodgkin.
And do you think that's because there's a lot of slippage for us as writers to go in and actually tease out things, because we don't actually ever know what was going on, as you said?
It's quite interesting. I know an obsessive Hodgkinite, mature student who's digging away, and he's found in, I think, one of the archives of the Tate, he's found this very extensive manuscript. I can't remember his name. He's the former head of education at the Tate. Did a whole load of interviews with Howard for a book that was never written. And in this set of interviews, I've seen some of the transcripts, Howard said, oh yes, the dots in that picture, they represent the fireworks that were going off outside number 23. We're in the garden of number 21. The green pillar, that's Mrs. T. She was my hostess on, and he's done it with about 30 paintings. And then he just stopped and thought, no, this is bollocks. And so it's never been published and it's barely known. But I don't think it really would help, even if you did know.
But those are very much the paintings of the 60s and 70s, where you can see him starting to create an iconography, bit by bit by bit. But at that stage, it's a bit clunky and it's a bit obvious sometimes. And it's only when he breaks through from that in the 70s and frees himself up and is entirely self-confident, the painting starts to take off.
But I think it's always there.
Well,
whatever the reality is, because I remember when I was writing my book about Howard, I began doing interviews with him, and we began talking about some of the pictures in very, very specific ways. And there was one picture called Indian Thoughts or something, and it was a picture with lots and lots and lots of speckly blobs. And I think Howard started saying to me, well, it was this evening and I was entranced by this person's conversation, and it was as if each word that they were saying was like a star exploding in the room.
Yeah.
And that's what those shapes are. And then he said, you know what, I don't think we're going to talk about the pictures like that, because we basically agreed from that point on that wasn't going to be the way that we'd do it, and that he would much rather, however badly wrong I got it, that I express what I think. So in other words, that he puts the emotion into the picture in his way. It's done in a very mysterious code-like form, but if it's done well enough, you'll get it.
You'll suck something back out from it.
Or you'll meet it with your own feelings, and that everybody will make their own painting by Howard. It's the same object, but everybody, when they meet that object, makes something different in their own sensibility out of it.
But that is the mystery. You don't want a dictionary. You don't want a series of this means that and that means that, and that kills the picture.
I think, as Howard recognised, that makes everything quite banal and literal.
But if you look at a lot of the work around in this show, for instance, the late prints, I think a lot of these are about death and extinction. And I don't think you need a dictionary or you need a grammar to understand that. What you see is Howard's classical veiling and framing, and you look what's at the centre, and what's at the centre is icy white. It's obliteration, again and again. That's the kind of thing that I think, if you look hard enough, you can pick up quite quickly.
And the titles, but I think the titles are also very important, and they're Howard's way sometimes of... He could almost calibrate the degree of ambiguity that he'd made in an image through the title. So, I mean, I remember at the Tate exhibition, there was a very beautiful late picture which was done, I think, at around the time of the Second Gulf War. And it's called Intimations of War. I think it's the Gulf War. But, and you know, that's a picture where Howard is clearly playing with the idea of, well, how do I make a history painting? How do I make an equivalent to those large paintings by Baron Grosch or Géricault of the Napoleonic Wars? And this is my answer to that. So we know what he's doing. He's not being very ambiguous. Whereas memories of, you might call a painting memories of H. So in that case, you're going, well, we're really up against it. You know, who's H? What are the memories? He's sort of saying, over to you.
Yeah, this is playing, isn't it? Because you get sometimes the literal titles, particularly downstairs. There's Grape Harvest or Ice Cream, and you literally read
the
a
specs
beat.
in front of his eyes as the sight's going. That's a very, very literal one.
Yes.
Right corner there, I think.
Yes,
yeah.
But it's almost like he's playing, because you get that. Then you get the literal reading of, say, the speckled blobs on the print as starbursts, but also he uses it as a painterly device to stop us going into the painting, but also entice us into the painting.
He'd be jolly pleased that we're sitting here scratching our heads now, I have to say.
Well, I think in those late pictures, what I detected in them, and I think Alan would agree with it, as we talked about it a bit, is that they're very much... I'm talking about the prints that are downstairs, that they really have the feeling of childhood memories, and that they're not, yes, they're complicated, but they're also very much not complicated. I mean, a glass of red, you know, there it is, a sort of swoosh of red wine. I mean, it's a glass of red. Ice cream, it's ice cream. You know, blueberry crumble. I mean, it's sort of almost, there's something very visceral about those images. It's almost, you can taste fish and chips. And, you know,
Well, I wanted to ask you both about that emotional side to his work before we get into detailed analysis of the actual print series themselves. But that, I think you've written very eloquently on this, Andrew Marr, that about the connection you feel, the emotional connection you feel to the work, that they speak. Instead of being puzzles to decode, which we've all agreed, I think we shouldn't do, they actually speak to you more like a poem. That
they're a visceral punch in the solar plexus again and again and again. I don't like the word colourist, because every painter, one way or another, is a colourist. What does colourist mean? But I think it's true to say that Howard's use of strong colour is unlike anybody else's in the history of painting and in the world. And the way he put some of those acid greens and blazing reds together, and the way he treats greys and browns and silvers is unlike anybody else. The blue Cristea painting there, print there, is a good example of. And he has a way of connecting the emotion that he is describing in the picture frame, the memory or the time, that kind of gets rid of words and gets rid of images. You don't need any of that, and he just grabs you and thumps you again and again. He's a very intensely emotional man. I can remember the great frustration of trying to interview him on camera for the BBC. And we were over at Sotheby's, I think, and we were in front of a room of paintings for sale, including there was a Matisse. And I started off by saying, you know, Howard, your greens are very, very interesting. And I'm very interested in the strip of green in the Matisse over there. And he looked over and he burst into tears. He said, yeah, the green. And so we moved on from that. And I said, and so Howard, who was the person who really started you drawing to start with? And he said, my father, and the same thing happened. He was a very, very emotional
Would
man.
have been brilliant as a political interviewee. Imagine.
Well,
So,
God,
your opinion about Brexit?
I tell you what, if I could get Boris next week weeping over Brexit, that would be a moment. I think Howard's a rather deeper person, and I think, and he's certainly given us more.
Well, we haven't yet seen Boris's, cardboard bus
His
collage.
bus.
So, we should reserve judgment. I think Alan's going to have an exhibition of them after the election.
God save us all.
I think it's interesting when you talk about, sorry to pull us off Boris, because he's such an interesting person to talk about, but I'd rather talk about Howard.
Yeah.
When you both first met Howard, did you go to the studio to meet him, or did he like to keep his conversations away from the studio, or did he allow access? Did you get to film him in the studio?
I filmed him at Sotheby's, and I met him actually in Alan's old gallery up in Cork Street, and I think we had a dinner or something there. And I can remember, I'm not going to repeat it because it was such a scandalous conversation about various other members of the art world and what he really thought about people such as, for instance, David Hockney, which I won't go into.
What a teaser.
But no, so yeah, it was in the context of galleries and all of that. I didn't go to the studio.
Andrew, did you go to the studio too?
No,
because of the book, you must have spent lots of time.
I always used to meet Howard in his house in Coptic Street, and then we would have. Well, in fact, when I was writing the book, I actually lived in the basement of his house for a few weeks, 2 or 3 weeks.
With him?
And no, Howard was in the big house. He had a paint studio, a paint factory. I mean, like a big square space about 4 times as big as this gallery, behind a Georgian house.
The dairy.
Opposite the British Museum. I think it had been a dairy and it had been a paint workshop. Anyway, that was his studio. So it's a very big space, contrasted massively to these small, darkly coloured, vividly decorated rooms of his house, which was all sort of eau de Nil and grey and dark brown and orange and Indian tiles, but all very intimate. And then you'd go into this massive white space studio. And it was always, I found it always a bit, I think it was a sort of ordeal for Howard, but he felt he had to do it. So he would show me like 8 or 10 pictures. And I always felt he was very nervous, and I was like really nervous because I thought, oh, I better say the right thing about the picture.
Was it because he didn't like talking about them?
It's interesting because he clearly didn't at one level like talking about, but for a man who didn't like to describe his art in great detail, he did a lot of interviews and he spoke to a lot of people, and there's a lot of words of Howard's own.
I mean, Howard believed, I think, very in a professional way, that it was part of his duty to himself as a painter to seek publicity and to be known. He felt that was part of the job, but I'm not sure it was the part of the job that he particularly liked. But I mean, I just remember he always had about 15 pictures on the go, but he had these sort of stretched thin canvases on big stretchers, which obstructed all of the pictures in the room. So you'd go into a room and you'd know that there were 20 pictures in the room, but they were all, as it were, behind hospital screens. And when Howard finished a picture, the hospital screens would come down, or Andy, his assistant, would take them down, and you'd be sitting in these astonishingly uncomfortable armchairs, surrounded by tubes of paint, and gradually one picture and another would be revealed.
And was it
And I always found it, as
one
I
at a
say,
time?
very nerve-wracking, because I thought, oh God, I better say the right thing, I better understand it properly.
I think we've all agreed that there is no...
But like when I was just with, I don't know if I was with Howard at one of his exhibitions, I never quite felt like that. But it was a sort of, it was very much like it was a very intimate thing to be showing somebody your new pictures. For him, it was clearly, an important thing, and for me too, and I can understand that.
It feels almost a religious way of showing them, to shroud everything and just present you one work at a time to look at, or certainly a singular vision that he wants you to bring to it.
I think it's fair to say he always believed in the magic. He always believed in the sense of suddenly that there's lots of veils in all his pictures and his work, but he believes in sweeping the curtain aside to reveal a moment that is kind of holy as far as he's concerned. Certainly his spiritual has a depth.
Well, he believed in the magic of an individual object. And he I think he believed that often his pictures weren't necessarily their own best friends. What he didn't like was, it's difficult to put it into words, but when Howard made a painting, it was about a particular thing for him.
And the picture was a particular physical object, and you had to remember that.
The picture, ideally, was a numinous reflection of this particular thing. And I remember that David Sylvester did a Magritte exhibition where he made chapels in the Hayward Gallery. He made chapels. So when you visited this Magritte show, you only ever saw one Magritte painting in a chapel at a time. You never saw a wall full of Magritte. And Howard thought that was great. And I had a feeling that he would have liked that for his own pictures, because this is a picture about, dinner with Anthony. This is a picture about war.
Yes.
I don't want them on the wall as two Howard Hodgkins. They're two completely different things.
They're not things of things. They're not pictures about things. They are the thing itself. At one kind of level, I feel particularly with the oil paintings, the painting, the incorporation of the frame, famously, it makes something that is more than a mere representation of something. It has a quality, a thisness of its own.
And that's sort of because he's working from his own memories. The potency of the memory is so strong that it replicates itself as an object.
And maybe that's where the sense of magic comes from. It's not a kind of reproduction of any kind. It is the thing itself.
I think all the words we're using to talk about the paintings, the magic, the secrecy, almost keeping them behind screens, showing one work at a time, you take a man like that who is not great at gives interviews but difficult to interview. You take someone like that who likes to work in the studio on his own, and you say, right, you're going to make prints, which involves going to another studio, often out of London. It involves working with other people. It involves giving away your marks to somebody else. I mean, how does a painter like Howard Hodgkin do that in the first place?
It's the one part of the trade, I think, which is communal, is in some respects social. And it's interesting that so many painters turn to printmaking, because I think the pressure of being alone by yourself in the studio with the white wall, whether you've got the hospital screens or not, is so much over the years that eventually, painters love to get together and gossip and bitch about each other, but ultimately you want to work with other people. And I think particularly for that generation who'd come through art colleges when they were at their highest, the tradecraft side of it was very, very important. And you think of somebody like Lucian Freud or indeed Hockney. They loved discussing the practicalities, the craft of printmaking, getting their hands dirty with printmakers who had spent their entire lives. And I'm sure Howard was the same, doing this.
Yeah, I think there's an element of collaboration in his work anyway in the later years. For example, there was that big picture he did after Seurat. There was a big exhibition where painters were invited to create homages to their favourite paintings in the National Gallery. So Patrick Caulfield did a homage to Thurbaran, and Howard did a homage to Seurat's Bathers at Asnières. And as far as I recall, he actually got Andy, his studio assistant, to, as it were, block out the entire composition in a rough form of the Bathers at Asnières, and then Howard Howardized, Hodgkinized, and made it into his own interpretation. But as an image, if you look at it, there are marks that, in 150 years' time, people will be saying, well, that's studio. That's Andy, and that's Howard. So I don't think, and I think this is true of some of his later works. Anthony probably know better than me, but I think in some of his later works, he did consciously work with Andy as a studio assistant. And I wouldn't know how much of it is, but in a way, that's one of the things that's very interesting, and I think the prints take us into that the bottom line is that Howard actually doesn't care if it's autograph, if it gets there, if it's what he wants. Because that's what's really, the prints are very, I didn't realise until Alan explained to me the method that he used, that the prints are painted by somebody else. So I don't really, I'd be very interesting to see, for example, 5 versions of Ice Cream, which is a print that I happen to own, which is the one downstairs. I'd be quite interested to see, say, 5 versions of it. Are they exactly the same? Can you make the wisp.
Well, you could photograph the one
Alan
downstairs and
says
then
they're
take it
not.
home.
They can't be. They can't
No, they're
be.
not. I was talking earlier about this one. No, they're different.
But isn't
only
it,
just,
but there's,
marginally
I mean,
different.
there's almost, I'm not a philosopher, but I think there's probably something philosophically to be said about this. Because it's not like Damien Hirst's dots, where there's nothing to lose in that there is no subtlety of handling, as it were. They are just
And you've
dots.
got 30 or 40 young artists working away in a factory.
Going dots, yeah, but there's nothing.
I can remember just going into David Hockney's studio in Bridlington. There's a big sign painted on the door which said, "The works in this studio are made by the artist himself with his own hands."
Right.
And I said, "I know who that's about." I said, "Yes, it's about Damien."
But that's what I think is interesting about the prints by Howard, because most of them are printed in working with the studio, but also hand painted. I mean, you can look around and you can see the painting aspect of them on the print, but the marks on them. So this giant one here, you can see the red is printed, but the yellow
That's
on the top
carborundum,
is.
but that is actually painted by someone
But
who's not Howard.
Yes,
Based
so-
on, but Howard did paint that or something very much like it.
And then they're copying Howard's marks.
So it's not like a print. It's not like a photograph that you're printing or.
But it is a print, equally, because it's
Well,
a.
it is. I
a
mean,
repro-
and I suppose when you think of Rembrandt's prints and the way in which prints, the actual technology, the metal, changes and coarsens with each new impression, and it's why, for example, a first impression of a particular print by Rembrandt could be worth £1 million, and one from 5 years later only, still done in Rembrandt's presence, is only worth £1,000. It's because so there is already within printing there is variation.
Yeah.
But I'm not quite sure. I still haven't got my head around what Howard is doing with that. Unless he's sort of, perhaps he's saying that it's his way of saying the difficult thing in all of this was to come up with that in the first place. Actually, mechanically putting it on the page is not that impossible. It's not that connected to my whole history. But the idea of it, it couldn't be done without me, the idea of it, and in a sense, the facture, he's almost making a kind of Vasarian point about the art residing in the mind.
And you come back to the iconography, in a sense, a relatively small number of gestures, of marks, of shapes, of spots, repeated again and again and again. And I think, like a lot of artists, as they get older, he strips away all that's inessential. He's left with a relatively small artillery of objects and gestures that he requires and colours. And the extraordinary thing is how much variation, how much expression, how much humour, how much anger, how much fear can be produced by a relatively small number of gestures. And that's what nobody else can do.
But I wonder if this highly unusual, as far as I know, unprecedented way of making a print is his way of really ramming it home at the end of his career that this is the point.
Could be.
Yes. Actually, at the level of material applying the pigment or the paint to the support, it's not that difficult. It's not that impossible. It's not that insuperable. But boy, it took me a long time to get here.
Yeah, also, he's talked about really, in lots of interviews, he talks about how he really doesn't want the prints to look like paintings. Now, clearly there's some superficial similarities, the same use of motifs, but he's really clear. He says, my prints are the results of thinking about what prints can be. The last thing I want them to be is substitute paintings. So I want to know really what you think prints brought to his practice, what he wanted to express in them.
Well, I think the first thing that you get is constant variation and alteration around, as I say again, a relatively small number of chosen gestures that have a meaning.
Because he even used the same plate, didn't he, in different colours to change the feel of the print.
Absolutely. So it gives you a kind of a sophisticated variation that you don't get if you're making a painting, because you only have the one painting, you have the object there in front of you, and however long you spend on it, in the end, it is itself. With a print, you can come back and again and again and again, and make tiny changes and alterations, change the colour, play around with the colour, as Warhol did endlessly, until you've got what you want. And I think that it's the variety. constant variety and unpredictability of the world that you get from the print that you don't get quite so much from a single painting.
Yes.
But a print, I suppose, thinking about this, because it seems like a slightly perverse thing to say, what he said, that he doesn't want a print to look like a painting, and yet he's getting people to paint his prints.
Exactly.
So, what do you mean? Obviously you do, because you're having a print that basically is a painting, or largely a painting, but where it is a print, is what, and Andrew's right, where it's a print is that it could be done infinite number of times.
And by somebody
because
else.
Usually you've got this carborundum template upon which the painting...
I think we've got one behind there.
Yeah, we can
I
see
feel
it.
like we're on some game show now. Can you bring the one we prepared earlier? Just because I think it's fascinating. So he would paint the plate with carborundum, which is a really thick paste, which gives you a 3D image on the plate. And then when you print from it, you have to have really thick paper, I think, and because the image goes inside into the paper, and the ink, it sort of draws the ink inside as well. So the image suddenly sits inside the paper.
Object.
Well, I wondered if it was a foil to the paintings, which of course he would paint on the actual wooden frame as his style matured, that he made the objects, as you said, Andrew, that he made the objects 3D. Is this sort of a reverse version of that, going into the paper?
And also you can sell them much more frequently and make quite a good income out of them. So it works well financially. It's the other thing we shouldn't forget.
But I think there's also, again, Alan, I'll have to ask you, but when he did that wonderful series called The Four Seasons, is it basically the same shapes and then everything else changed?
Exactly the same composition,
So,
printed and painted in different colours.
yeah. So that's an example of that is essentially using the wonder of the print, which is that, yes, I can take the same shapes and forms, and then through the motif of the four seasons, they can be utterly different from winter to summer, but I'm starting with the same basic template. So I think there's something very... I mean, when I started writing about Howard, he didn't really want me to mention his prints. He just wanted me to talk about him as a painter. That's what he thought, because he hadn't really been written about when I wrote that book. It was the first book. And
that was before he was working with Alan and Cristea, wasn't it? It was like a really early stage.
I can't remember the date, but I mean, it's, we're talking about the mid-80s. And he had done prints, but I have the feeling that it became much, much more important to him later on. At the beginning, he just was very, very focused on wanting to be sort of recognised as a painter and written about as a painter.
He didn't want to confuse the...
I don't think he wanted to. I don't think he felt it would have been helpful.
Since we're sitting next to Green Thoughts, could I read a stanza of Andrew Marvell, which I think more and more actually represents or explains some of the mystery in Howard Hodgkin. So that's Green Thoughts over there. And this is from the poem itself. Meanwhile the mind from pleasure less withdraws into its happiness, the mind, that ocean where each kind doth straight its own resemblance find, yet it creates, transcending these, far other worlds and other seas, annihilating all that's made to a green thought in a green shade.
Oh, and a round of applause, I think, for that.
Well, I wrote it down, so I didn't want to waste it.
That's the third Andrew.
Of course, Andrew Marvell, yeah, nice 17th century poem to pep us up. That was the Green Thought that we were talking about, is the name of the exhibition that you wrote the catalogue for. And I agree with you, it totally sums up for me what Howard did with his paintings and his prints, which is that reducing something so potent to an essence of just a single thing.
And the mind withdraws into the painting, and then other worlds and other seas are created alongside it. That's the sort of magic that we're talking about.
And poetry seems to be really important to him throughout. Old music, so he did a series called Into the Woods based on the Sondheim.
He's a proper sort of polymathic, cultured man of the old school. We say on the day where we've just lost Jonathan Miller, who hated the phrase, of course.
But yes, equally appropriate. Andrew Graham-Dixon, you've also talked about poetry in relation to Howard's work, but you talked about haiku for the work. If you haven't seen it, do go downstairs and look at the last series, because they are a kind of distillation of life. But you talked about them as haiku, which I thought was equally potent in describing it. The idea of a Japanese poem, very limited number of syllables to create an image.
Yeah, I mean, the haiku is a literary form that plays on the edge of banality. I mean, absolutely on the edge of banality. You know, a frog jumps into the water, plop, end of haiku.
But it should.
That's the most famous haiku of all. That's the best haiku. But the way it works is that there's a sort of an infinity, and in that description of that singular moment. And I think that Howard's work is about, at one level, it's about the way in which every life is made from a continuum of single moments. And it's the magic of his work to distill and stop time, both at one and the same time. And sometimes there is Howard once said to me, when my pictures are, my pictures are good, they perhaps have something of Bonnard, that they're like life itself. If they don't work, I worry that they're just like nothing. There's nothing there. And I think what I'm trying to say is that the haiku is a form. It's a huge risk. You jump off a diving board, and you might only be an inch off the ground, and you might make a fool of yourself. And then there's a great deal of vulnerability in Howard's work. That he's making often works of art about things that are very, especially in those late works. That's what I meant. That's what I meant to say, is that they are about very simple, I think, childhood memories, a lot of them.
Yes.
And yet, all of our lives are made up of those things. So that, yes, in a sense, they're trivial. But Howard's part of that argument. Howard's very much, I always think, one of the things that makes it a bit difficult for us to perhaps see Howard is that he is a member of the French artistic generation that began with Géricault and finished with Monet, and Matisse maybe. But he seems to me that he's very much, he's a member of that generation, which is a generation engaged in a huge argument with the forces of the past about what serious art is.
I was wondering about somebody completely different, which you'll probably snort, which is Hogarth, because it seems to me he's also a very social painter. And in the iconography, he is trying to recreate moments in society a lot of the time. And I kind of get the sense of a gale of laughter and conversation going through a lot of his work. And weirdly, that makes me think of Hogarth.
Certainly some of the earlier pictures, I think that is true. And there are pictures that do seem full of, well, they might be seen as conversation pictures.
Exactly, yes.
But I think overall, my feeling is that he's closer to that redefinition. There's a redefinition of what the subject of painting is that takes place between really 1820 and 1920, 1930. And it moves painting from being about the great battles and the great wars and the great
to being the
moment,
subjects,
to being about what is an individual life made of.
At that point, is there any, because of the artist you've talked about, it was also about the mark, about how you create or you lay these thoughts down on the surface? Because I think, for me, that the marks get less or refined in his work.
It's one of the great cliches that with a really good painter, they get better as they get older because they can cast aside all the bits that aren't absolutely essential, and you're left with the pure and essential towards the end. That's clearly what happens with Howard's painting, I think. But if we say again and again, what is a painting? A painting is an object with a subject. And I think what interests me so much about Howard Hodgkin is that he keeps both of those things together. He's always interested in the subject, whether it is the ice cream, whether it's the childhood memory, whether it's the conversation, whether it's a fear of death, whether it's a portrait of a friend, or there is always a subject there. And I think, because that is the big trouble and the problem with modern painting. And in a very, very different way, Bridget Riley is struggling with it exactly the same. She comes up with different solutions and a different way of painting and a different iconography. Gillian Ayres in a different way again. But of all those people struggling to find a way to converse with an audience, to find a way to communicate through paint and through printmaking, I think Howard is going to be remembered for a very, very long time, because I think he kind of cracked it.
And even something as straightforward as a sunset, so the work we have behind us here, we can call it a sunset and then we read it as that, but actually it does play with that figuration abstraction thing, because Howard's infamous for not wanting to be called an abstract painter, but he does reduce it to just pure emotion, really, something like this, or a pure feeling.
And it's a little bit dark and a little bit scary, which is not the first thing you talk about a sunset. You know, the sun is going down in all sorts of ways, Gary.
You alluded to that earlier about him contemplating death in these later prints, but they're still very full of life, aren't they?
They are, but I find them scary. I mean, the print, The Gate, I think I talked about, which is not here at the moment, but it's cold greens and dark, and then this blank, horrifying white in the middle of it. It's an existential horror painting. Yeah. So he can do funny, lively, witty, engaging pictures that are about the joys of life, the glass of red wine or the ice cream or whatever, and he can do, using a very, very similar very small range of gestures and shapes and colours, something which has a completely different meaning. And that, to me, is the word again and again, that is the magic or the extraordinary nature of Howard's art. So a relatively small repertoire with an entire world which it represents.
Yeah. Do you think was he aware of, did he feel out of time when he was, I mean, clearly in the 80s he, was awarded prizes and represented the country, but did he feel that out of time? Because in the 80s in the UK the sculptors were Richard Deacon or Tony Cragg were kind of making the headlines, and in America there were painters, but they were much more brash, figurative painters. Did he feel like he was continuing this tradition from the 19th century, or did he feel that the world was against him?
I don't think, I mean, when I said what I said about him sort of feeling to me like a late member of that generation, that's my perception. I mean, it's not only that. I mean, Howard had a very strong sense of connection with Turner, for example. We used to go to the Tate and we used to look at, we used to sometimes, as I do still, go to the Tate Britain and just go up to that room and knock on the door, and they will get out Turner's watercolours for you and you can look at them. And we used to do that. We used to look at the Houses of Parliament watercolours, the 1843 Venice sketchbook, which has got an amazing watercolour, which has got, I think Howard said, it's got Rothko, it's got Matisse, it's got everything in there. It's the Turner's bedroom in the Hotel Europa. It's got that in it, in the background. And we used to look at, I mean, I remember once going to see a Bellini from Birmingham. It was from the Barber Institute that had been lent to the National Gallery. And it's one of those Bellini Sacra Conversazioni, where the saints who are thinking about the Madonna in the foreground are in sharp focus. But you look at the Madonna, and she's out of focus, just slightly out of focus, which is Bellini's way of indicating to us that she is actually in their mind. She's not there. It's not a painting of the Madonna in the presence of St. Jerome and St. Lucy. St. Jerome and St. Lucy are contemplating the Madonna. And Howard said, isn't that a wonderful idea? So he was always looking, and he's influenced me a lot in this, in the sense that I think of painting as a language, painting as being philosophically deep and intense in what it's saying. And so that lack of focus expresses a religious version of the Platonic idea of some realities being higher than others, but it's in a painting.
But it's a funny language, isn't it? Because it's a language where you have to start with completely new words and a new grammar every so often. I mean, the language of painting now is so different from the language of painting even in the 1960s.
But Howard's way of where Howard placed himself in answer to your question, Charlotte, would be that I don't think he would have had this connection with Turner, but he had this, clearly a deep connection with people like Degas and those artists. But he also looked very intensely at Bellini. I remember Anthony and some friends and Howard and we all went to Ghent to see the Ghent altarpiece. And I remember a load of tourists talking way too loud and Howard reaching up. There was a sign on the wall saying, "Please do not talk." And Howard sort of taking it off, dusting it, showing it to everybody and putting it back so that we could all look at the Ghent altarpiece. And I said to him once, why do you look at old art as much as you do? And he said, well, these objects, a painting is an object, and it's a thing. It might be a rectangle, it might be a square, it might be that thick, it might be that. It's a thing, and I need to understand what magic they put into their things. I mean, because I want my things to stand the same test of time as that. And if you're an artist, you have to look at the art of the past because you haven't got any other home. That's what he said. That's my home, the art of the past. So he was very, and I think looking at things like this, I mean, for whatever reason, I mean, I own 2 very beautiful Chinese calligraphic scrolls, which are about 10 feet wide, and I've got ice cream next to those, and they look fantastic together.
Different form of mark.
And so I've never thought of that particularly, but looking at that, I think, well, was Howard? I mean, I never discussed Chinese or Japanese art with him in any way. But when you think of, that to me looks a bit like, I don't know, it's the Great Wave, is it? But not quite, but you know what I mean? It's that...
But he was constantly looking, from what you said, when he was travelling, when he was away, he was just always looking, absorbing, connecting with the past to create these moments from his own personal past. But you've talked about being universal, that he could make the personal universal.
The obvious and the famous thing that everybody knows, and I'm sure Howard's had lots and lots of conversation with Andrew about, of course, is Indian art. And I think he picks in particular ranges of colours and use of colour from Indian art. But yeah, he's anybody who's a good painter. I think anybody who's a good painter is really interesting to talk with about painting because they all look and they all think hard about the part of the heritage they're part of. And that mysterious thing, how with a relatively small number of marks, when you're walking past something, do I nail your bloody feet to the floor so you can't look away and you spend more time than you expected to spend just staring at something, and the crackle of the electricity comes off the wall. That's what they're looking for, and it's done in totally different ways, decade by decade by decade. But I come back to the thing I said right at the beginning, which it seems to me, in terms of how do you make a genuinely new picture in 2018 or 2020 or 2019, you need to find your language. You need to find a language which isn't just yours, but actually does, like any language, properly communicate, properly send its electricity out. And that's what I think he manages to do.
For about, 50 years I was a scenic artist at the Royal Opera House. And it was wonderful during the 80s that we had people like Patrick Caulfield, David Hockney, Helen Frankenweiler, a whole number of artists selected by Brian Robertson from Whitechapel. And Howard was probably the last one in. And I had to paint his set for a ballet.
Interesting.
And ever since then, actually, when I look at certainly these paintings, these prints here, they remind me of the stage. You have the borders along the top, you have the sides, and the actual ballet floor itself. And it's almost like looking through a proscenium arch onto a set. I don't know if you've ever thought of in those terms, but that's how I see so many of his paintings now.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, I wrote about it in my book about how I'd written many years ago. I wrote exactly about this, that the paintings are like, particularly the framed ones, where he's painting on the frames, they are like a proscenium arch stage set, a sort of miniature theatre, within which you see these tiny glimmerings. And I remember Patrick Caulfield saying to me, perhaps slightly indiscreetly, saying, well, I just don't understand why Howard does this bloody thing to himself. I mean, painting on the frame, what's that all about? I mean, painting's hard enough anyway. It's like breaking your own leg and going to work every day with a broken leg. Why do you do it to yourself? And I think Howard did himself, to a certain extent, recognise that this was a limiting force on him, this painting of the frame, and it became less intrusive, if you like, or less pronounced. I think he explained it to me in the very first interview, the very first time I ever met him. I was a very young journalist for The Independent, and I'd been detailed to write an article about frames and framing and how artists frame their work, and he was famous for painting on the frame. And he said it was all to do with vulnerability and his feeling that his subjects were so vulnerable that he wanted to protect them from the world. And if he made a painting that someone else could frame, then he wouldn't have determined the amount of protection. So it was almost like having a broken leg. The work of art was a broken leg for him, or it was a wound, or as W.H. Auden said of bad poetry, it's like somebody's bandaged up their arm and sent it to me in the post.
I spent a few days with Howard, well, a weekend with Howard in Rouen, and we went around the markets, and he collected at least 5 frames from the market.
Was that when he had his exhibition?
No, it was a weekend it was extraordinary actually, because earlier we were talking about the chapel, this idea of the chapel. And of course the studio he had in Rouen was a chapel. And what amazed me was that he took me into this chapel, and as you say, all the paintings were facing the wall, so you couldn't see them. But then it occurred to me the reason for that was that he was waiting for them to dry. Because each brushstroke would have to dry before he could apply another brushstroke. And he would paint with a mixture of 3:1, 3 parts oil, 1 part terps. And so each brushstroke could take months to dry before he could apply the next one.
They're very juicy.
But we still get the frame in the prints where doesn't apply quite so much.
No.
I think the only other thing I'd say about the framing thing is there is an element of Howard's painting which is highly theatrical, even operatic. It's the ta-da, look at me, and the frame helps that too. You know.
Was it Mark Morris? Was it Mark Morris, the ballet?
No, it's by Ashley.
Frederick Ashton?
No, Ashley Page.
Oh, right.
It was called Piano.
Right.
Yeah.
Thanks for your very enjoyable discussion. I mean, I can hear all the way through this, I thought anyway, of the constant struggle of how to differentiate language from painting or language from drawing, because as Richard Wollheim spells out very nicely, painting is not language. It's not language in the way it doesn't express a grammar, anything like language. It doesn't express propositions, or if it tries to, it's not art any longer. So the constant struggle of talking about communication is difficult, because if you turn it into spoken communication, you may already start to damage it or to put it into another form which it doesn't belong in. As Thomas Addis, the composer, said on the radio about a year ago, I don't want my art to be communication. It's not. I'm not saying anything to anybody. I have no interest in saying anything.
Yeah,
I think you were talking about
profoundly disagree with that final point. I mean, I think when we're talking about language, it's a metaphor, it's a simile. It's obviously painting is no more like language than music is like architecture. But what I do think, it's my belief, and it may be wrong, is that it is about communication. And that a good painting communicates something that from inside the artist, about the artist's view of the world, view of themselves, view of the human condition, which can then be communicated to another human being through paint, through colour, and through shape. And so to that extent, it is a language. It's a way of speaking to another person, not using words, obviously, not using sound, but using the rhythms and the shapes and the colours of a painted surface.
And the connection with our emotion,
Yeah.
the way you talk about
Yeah.
it hitting you, the feeling. A bit maybe like the analogy we make to poetry, which does use a more traditional language, that we get that sense of the words kind of, or the images meaning something to us that we can't articulate. But sitting up here, we do have to try.
I made a film about 4 years ago about the Ice Age, because the British Museum had an exhibition called The Art of the Ice Age, and I met some very interesting people who've done some very interesting research, and I spent some time in the caves. And basically, the human brain has not changed whatsoever for 200,000 years. There's been absolutely no evolution. So you take somebody born in a cave in Altamira, 60,000 years BC, and you put them in Camden Grammar School, they get the same results as any kid now. There's been no change whatsoever in the human brain. But what we do know, as themes, is that 60,000 to 70,000 years ago, human beings started doing three things, and they started doing exactly the same time. And if you take all of human life, say all of human life since evolution is a day. This is at 11:33 and 20 seconds. Human beings, as a species, started speaking, writing, painting, and making music, all at the same time. So I would say that they are all exactly the same activity, or they are part of exactly the same thing, and they're all communication, without any doubt.
I think that leaves us a
they
good...
might communicate different stuff, and in the postmodern chaos, you might have the idea of an art that doesn't communicate as a radical counter to being communicative, because you want to revert to being a pre-human, non-communicative thing, and you want to cover your canvases with something that's whatever, but I think it's communication.
I think that's quite a deep, profound point to end on. But I want to give Howard the last word. Of course, he died in 2017, isn't here today, but I think he deserves the last word. So bear with me on this, it's not very long. This is Howard from 2003. I have never enjoyed printmaking, but I equally hate painting. I am growing old and I do what I can. And with that, I think we should thank our very esteemed panel and Howard Hodgkin.